Whenever we're thinking about whether or not Christians can fight in wars, there are three main responses to that question. The first is called activism, and that's the idea that government is set up by God and governments declare wars, and so it's always okay for the Christian to fight in a war. And that response is so easy to refute that we're not even going to spend any time on it. Instead, I want to focus on the other two, which are pacifism and selectivism. Now, pacifism is the belief that Christians should never participate in a war to the point of killing another human being, because human life is valuable, we're made in the image of God, and famous examples of this, or famous people who carried this out, were Desmond Doss from Hacksaw Ridge. Whereas selectivism is the belief that some wars are just, and so to fight in those wars is to pursue justice, which is a thing that Christians should do. And famous examples of this would be like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian slash pastor slash all-round legend who was involved in several attempts to assassinate Hitler. So let's go through a few pacifist arguments, and then a few counter arguments, and then a few selectivist arguments and a few counter arguments for those, and we'll see what we think. The first argument for pacifism is that killing is wrong, and I think we would all agree that killing's wrong. If you don't think killing is wrong, you need help. Pacifists would rightly say that human beings are made in the image of God. The imago Dei is the Latin for that, if you want to sound kind of fancy. And so because of this, humans have incalculable value. And crucially, that value doesn't come from themselves. It isn't increased or diminished by what they do, or where they live, or what political party they support. It's based on God, and God doesn't change. And so, whether they are your political enemy or your political ally, they still are just as valuable. And so to take a human life is a terrible thing, because it snuffs out that image of God. It does something which the pacifist would argue only God has the right to do. And crucially, the pacifist would argue that killing is killing, regardless of whether you do it to someone in your society or a member of someone else's society, or regardless of whether you are wearing a military uniform or not. They would say that you as a human are a moral agent, you're free to make your own decisions, and so you can't just plead that, oh, I was just obeying orders, because we've seen that whenever war crimes are committed under order, the people who committed those things are still guilty. So killing is wrong, and just because it is state sanctioned doesn't make it okay. Pacifism argument number two is that resisting evil with physical force is wrong. And this argument kind of builds off the previous one, because if one believes that physical force is evil, then necessarily resisting evil with physical force is itself evil. Instead, the pacifist would argue that physical force should be resisted with the spiritual force of love. And they would look to Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, whenever he says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. They'd also point to Romans 12, where Paul says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give them something to drink. That you should overcome evil with good. And as part of this argument as well, pacifists would point to the life of Jesus. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. His life was marked by peace. There were times when the disciples wanted to enact violence. I mean, Jesus rebuked James and John whenever they wanted to fireball a Samaritan town, and he told Peter off for chopping off a guy's ear. And this second incident took place at Jesus' arrest, and it was seen by the early Christians as really, really significant in knowing how we should deal with things like war. Tertullian, the early church father, said that when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed every Christian, and that was a super popular idea in the early church, because they believed that violence ran totally contrary to the way of the Prince of Peace. Now, the third argument I want to cover for pacifism is that if we as Christians take part in a war and kill someone, we could be sending them straight to hell. You see, we as Christians, we have eternal security. We know that if we die, we're going to rise again, we're going to be with Jesus, but our enemies don't necessarily have that security. And so if we are choosing to fight, then we are choosing to allow for the possibility that we could kill someone, and in killing them, send them straight to hell. And obviously that's not a good thing. It doesn't sit all that well with Jesus' commands to love your enemies and to make disciples of all the nations. So those are the three pacifism arguments I want to cover. They're not the only ones, but I think they're probably the most popular, maybe some of the strongest. So now we'll look at some counter arguments for those. But before we do that, I just want to say that if you're finding this video helpful so far, then please do hit it with a like. That way it can spread to more people and hopefully help more people. So thank you. So in response to the claim that killing is always wrong, some would argue that that isn't necessarily the case. The sixth commandment, which people kind of remember as you shall not kill, is probably better translated you shall not murder. And obviously killing and murder are two very different things. The laws themselves in Exodus actually allow for this, because the sixth commandment comes in Exodus 20, but in Exodus 21 and 22, there are allowances made for killing in self-defense and capital punishment. Also, the Old Testament does have wars in it. And while some people kind of overblow these accounts, there are very much wars in them. And these wars aren't just even sanctioned by God, they are at times commanded by God. And while we can't use those wars as a template for how we engage in war today, Deuteronomy 20 says so, they're still examples of God commanding war. Now, to the claim that resisting evil with physical force is wrong, the selectivist might point to that passage in Matthew 5 and say that actually, whenever Jesus is talking about slapping on the cheek and turning the other cheek, what he had in mind was more insult rather than injury. Because if you think about it, a right-handed person, which most people were at that time, couldn't slap a person in the right cheek without it being backhanded. This is quite complicated. He does specifically say if someone slaps you in the right cheek, turn the other cheek. But if you wanted to slap someone with your right hand on the right cheek, it would have to be backhanded, and that was seen as an insult rather than something that was going to cause injury. On top of that, the selectivist might also say that physical force as a means of spreading the kingdom, that is wrong. That's the thing that Jesus prohibits, but physical force as a means of self-defense isn't necessarily wrong. We'll talk about that more in a wee minute. And then for the third argument that in war we could be sending people to hell, I do think that that is a really terrible thing. But in this equation, there are more parties involved than just you as an individual and the enemy in front of you. You've also got to take into account the civilian populations on both sides as well as your allies. You see, you as a Christian could shoot an enemy soldier and send them straight to hell. That is not a good thing. But what if they were about to throw a grenade and kill 5 of your allies and send them straight to hell? Or what if, upon winning that particular battle, they would go into a civilian town and kill loads of civilians? I think the pacifist makes this equation very, very simple by giving an absolute black and white and saying, no, killing is always wrong. But I don't think this is a clear-cut issue. I think there's too much nuance there. And while the pacifist might make that thinking very easy, make the decision easy, perhaps they oversimplify what is actually a complex moral situation. As I said though, those are not the only arguments for pacifism, but now let's move on to some arguments for selectivism. Now, argument for selectivism, number 1, the disciples had a sword. In Luke 22, Jesus tells the disciples to go and buy a sword, and that's why Peter had one in the Garden of Gethsemane whenever he chopped the servant of the high priest's ear off. Now, whenever Jesus tells Peter here to stop, that is one of the strongest arguments, I think, for pacifism. But it could also be argued that that was actually Jesus saying, no, it's not right to try and pursue the kingdom and to try and bring the kingdom down through violence. Because later on, whenever Jesus is talking to Pilate, he says, my kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my disciples would be fighting for me. So if violence is off limits as a means for spreading the kingdom, then what other reason could Jesus have for telling the disciples to buy a sword if it wasn't for self-defense? Like Jesus literally said to them in Luke 22, get a sword. And so if violence is okay as a form of self-defense, what is war really but a national form of self-defense? So that's the first argument for selectivism. The second is John the Baptist's silence with soldiers. So in Luke 3, some soldiers come to John the Baptist and they're like, hey, how can we live a more godly life? And John doesn't tell them, stop being soldiers, stop killing people. No, instead, he basically tells them to be good soldiers. He says, don't extort money, don't accuse people falsely, don't complain about your pay. Now, surely if war is wrong and it's not okay for Christians to take part in it, this would have been the perfect opportunity for John to say that. But he didn't say it, and so it must be okay on occasion. Now, the third argument for selectivism is that the state has the authority to bear the sword. The New Testament affirms the sword as a means of human justice. For example, Paul says in Romans 13 that if you do wrong, you better be afraid because the government doesn't bear the sword in vain. Jesus recognized that Pilate had God-given authority over his life. When Paul stood before a Roman court in Acts 25, he said, if I've done anything deserving of death, I don't refuse to die. And in Acts 23, whenever his life is in danger as he's on his way to that Roman court, he enlists the help of Roman soldiers who are going to protect him on his journey, presumably when threatened through the use of physical violence. Now, again, those are not the only 3 arguments for selectivism, but they're probably the most common, perhaps the strongest. Now, let's look at some counter-arguments. First of all, this incident where the disciples were told to get a sword. That argument for selectivism relies on the literal interpretation of Jesus' words when he says, go and get a sword. But Jesus often uses the word sword as a metaphor throughout the Gospels, and so he could have been speaking metaphorically here. So then the pacifist would argue that in Luke 22, Jesus was talking about a metaphorical sword rather than a literal sword. And so whenever the disciples bring 2 swords and they say, look, we've got 2 swords, and Jesus says that is enough, the alternative understanding of this would be that Jesus' tone here is more in the sense of, that's enough. come on, like, I'm clearly not talking about a literal sword, whereas the selectivist would say, okay, yeah, 2 swords, that's enough. That'll do. Bam, bam. That's all you need. And as far as I'm aware, there's no actual consensus on this. Scholars are kind of divided, so to be honest, I think you're just gonna believe whichever interpretation supports your pre-existing views on this. Second up, John the Baptist's silence with a soldier. Surely this means if you didn't condemn it, it means that being a soldier is okay. Well, this is what's called an argument from silence, and it's not super strong. It's basically an appeal to a lack of information, because John, if he had said that killing is always wrong and that you shouldn't be a soldier, or if he had said it is okay for you to be a soldier and to engage in warfare, then it's an open and shut case. It's super easy. But because he didn't condone it or condemn it, we can't for certain say what he thought. And so this is not a super tight argument. Just because he didn't say here that it's wrong doesn't mean that it is right. And then the counter argument for the third argument, that the state has the authority to bear the sword, the pacifist might argue that yeah, while the state does have the authority to bear the sword, it doesn't necessarily have the credibility, because the state might declare a so-called just war, but who's to say that they're right to do so? Who's to say that their assessment of the situation is correct? Perhaps there is no such thing as a just war. Now, while there is no consensus on pacifism versus selectivism for Christians, I do think that we as Christians have got to be people of peace, not people who gravitate towards violence or who delight in aggression, but people who strive for peace. Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, interestingly not the peacekeepers. And that means that we are to be people who go to where there is no peace and bring peace. That might look like Desmond Doss, who risked his life to save the lives of so many others, or it might look like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who risked his life to try and assassinate Hitler. Now, the big question we're left with here is that if some wars are permissible and if Christians can fight in them, how do we know which wars those are? And that is answered by something called the just war theory. So if you want to know what that is, then you can watch this video here, or if this video is not out, then here's another video you like. But I'll see you in that. God bless.